What happens when the wind suddenly stops, the sun loses its warmth, and a massive metal craft, the size of a cathedral, silently blots out the heavens? Two climbers were about to find out just how little they mattered to the ancient powers of this world. From paralyzed limbs to the smell of ozone and burning air, this is the full account of an encounter with the weavers of the mist. Fasten your gear. We're heading into the death zone. But wait, are you ready for more unexplained encounters and cinematic mysteries? Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. I remember the cold first. It was not the sort of chill that nips at your nose on a crisp morning in the valley. It was a living, hateful thing. It sought to find the gaps in our heavy wool coats and the seams of our leather gloves. It wanted to stop our hearts. We were high up on the ridge, far above the world of men, where the air is thin and offers no comfort to the lungs. The wind did not just blow. It screamed. It shoved against us like a drunkard in a tavern brawl, trying to push us off the narrow spine of ice and down into the abyss. My pack felt like it was filled with lead rather than supplies. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. I looked at the man ahead of me, his shape blurred by the stinging snow that whipped around us. He was bent double, fighting to lift his boots. I could hear the rhythm of it, even over the gale. The sharp crunch of the iron claws strapped to our feet, biting into the hard, blue ice. Crunch, step, breath, crunch, step, breath. It was the only clock we had. The village we had left that morning felt like a memory from a different life. It was gone, hidden beneath layers of cloud and mist. Up here, there was nothing but the white and the gray. We were intruders. I felt it in my bones. The mountains did not want us here. These peaks were the thrones of giants, and we were stubborn insects crawling on their backs. Then the sun broke through the storm, but it brought no warmth. It was a harsh, blinding flare that bounced off the snowfields. It burned our eyes. It was a cold fire, illuminating the vast emptiness around us. I squinted against the glare, feeling the sweat freeze on my forehead under my cap. My chest heaved, begging for air that wasn't there. Every breath tasted like iron, a sharp, metallic tang of exhaustion in the back of my throat. We stopped for a moment to rest, though stopping was dangerous. To stop was to freeze. I looked out over the edge. The drop was endless. A man could fall for a long time before the rocks broke him. The silence between the gusts of wind was heavy. It was the silence of a place that has never known the sound of a human voice. I felt a strange unease settle in my gut, deeper than the fear of falling. It was the feeling of walking into a room where you are not welcome, just before the owner turns to look at you. We were too high. We had gone too far. And as I looked at the jagged horizon, I felt small. Not just small in size, but small in significance. We were nothing against this ancient, frozen stone. And we were about to find out just how little we mattered. The change did not happen slowly. It was not like a storm blowing itself out, getting tired and fading into a breeze. It was instant. It was violent in its suddenness. 1 second, the gale was tearing at our coats, screaming in our ears so loud we could not hear our own boots hitting the ice. The next second, dead quiet. It was as if a great hand had reached down from the heavens and smothered the mouth of the world. The roar vanished. The flapping of our loose straps stopped. We stood there, frozen, leaning into a wind that was no longer pushing back. I nearly fell over from the lack of resistance. We looked at each other, waiting for the sound to return, but the mountain stayed mute. That silence was not peaceful. It was heavy. It was a weight. It pressed against the eardrums. You know the feeling when you dive too deep in a lake and the water squeezes your head? It was like that. My ears popped, a sharp, cracking pain deep inside the skull. I opened my mouth and swallowed hard to clear them, but the pressure stayed. It sat on my chest like a wet wool blanket. It felt as though the air itself had been sucked away, leaving something thicker in its place. I looked around for the black birds that usually followed us, hoping for scraps of bread. They were gone. The sky was empty. The mountain goats we had seen earlier, balancing on the needle rocks below, had vanished into the cracks of the earth. The mountain was not just quiet. It was still. It was holding its breath, waiting for a blow to land. Then came the taste. It flooded my mouth, sharp and sour. It tasted like I had been sucking on an old copper coin or licking the side of a brass kettle. I spit into the snow, trying to clear the foulness, but the taste came from the air itself. It coated the tongue. Beside me, Miller rubbed his face, looking confused. He pulled at his collar. I saw the hair on his arms, where his sleeves had pulled back. The hairs were standing straight up, stiff as wire. I felt it too, a prickling on the back of my neck, like ants crawling under the skin. The air felt charged, restless. It was the feeling you get right before lightning strikes a tree in the valley, that buzz that makes your teeth ache. But there were no storm clouds. The sky was clear and bright. This was a storm without rain, a thunder without sound. We stood there, two men on a ridge, shaking not from the cold, but from the wrongness of it all. The sun was high above us. It should have been the brightest part of the day. But then the darkness fell. It did not creep in like the evening. It slammed down. I looked up, expecting to see a storm cloud blocking the light, ready to curse the weather for turning on us again. But there was no cloud. There was no mist. There was a shape blotting out the heavens, something solid and terrible. It hung there, right above our heads. It looked like a great church bell, but one grown to a monstrous size. It was as big as the cathedrals in the cities below, floating as easily as a dandelion seed in a summer breeze. But it looked heavy. You could feel the weight of it just by looking. It was made of metal, but not like the steel of a bridge or the iron of a stove. It was dull. It was the color of old bronze that has been left in the rain. It drank the sunlight and gave nothing back. I strained my eyes, trying to make sense of it. I looked for the rivets. I looked for the seams where sheets of metal had been hammered together by workers. I looked for windows or chimneys. There were none. It was all one piece. It was smooth as a river stone, seamless as a bird's egg. It had no propellers to churn the air and keep it aloft, no wings to ride the wind. It simply ignored the laws that pull men and rocks down to the earth. It sat upon the emptiness, mocking the very ground we stood on. It made no noise. A thing that size should have roared like a train. It should have thundered and shook the ice loose. Instead, it hummed. It was a low, deep vibration that I felt in the soles of my feet more than I heard with my ears. It was a feeling like standing next to a massive pipe organ just before the note is played. The loose snow around our boots began to dance and tremble from the power held inside that shell. The sheer size of it broke something in my mind. It dwarfed the jagged peaks around us. It was a mountain built of shadow and strange metal, hanging upside down in the sky. My brain tried to tell me it was a trick of the light, a mirage from the thin air. But my gut knew it was real. I tried to step back. I tried to turn and run down the slope. But my legs were like dead wood. They refused to listen. Fear had rooted us to that spot, forcing us to stare up at a false god that had come to block out our sun. The sickness hit me in the gut first. It was not the slow ache of bad food or the dizziness of the high air. It was a punch. My stomach turned over, violent and sudden. I fell to my knees in the snow, gagging, trying to empty a belly that was already empty. It felt as if my insides were trying to twist away from the thing above us. Beside me, I heard Miller retching, his sound swallowed by that unnatural quiet. We were strong men, used to blood and hardship, but this presence turned our strength into water. I pulled the compass from my pocket with trembling fingers, looking for direction, for some sanity in the world. The needle, usually so steady and true, pointing north, was possessed. It spun wildly in its brass case. It whirled round and round, like a trapped fly buzzing against a window pane. It ignored the earth. It ignored the poles. It only knew the metal beast hanging in the sky. I snapped the lid shut, terrified that the device itself had gone mad. Then the air turned poison. It did not smell of pine or snow anymore. It smelled sharp and burning. It was the scent of lightning when it strikes close, mixed with the stench of yellow sulfur from the deep pits of the earth. It burned the throat. Every breath was a struggle, like inhaling smoke from a damp fire. We coughed and wheezed, clutching our chests, but the air gave no relief. It felt thick, like we were breathing soup instead of wind. I tried to look up at the shape again, but my eyes refused to focus. The edges of the gray metal seemed to ripple. It was like looking at a stone at the bottom of a rushing stream, shifting and wavering, or like the air above a hot road in summer. But there was no heat here. The lines of the craft refused to stay still. It made my head pound to look at it, a sharp spike of pain behind the eyes. It was a thing that did not belong in a shape that human eyes were meant to see. And with the sickness came the feeling of eyes. 1,000 invisible eyes, pressing on us from all sides. We were exposed. There was nowhere to hide on that ridge. I felt naked, stripped of my coat and my courage. And the cold changed. It was no longer just the winter air. It was a piercing, unnatural chill that ignored my layers of wool and leather. It went straight to the marrow of the bone. It was the cold of the grave. I do not know how long we knelt there in the snow, sick and freezing. Time seemed to stretch and snap. A second felt like an hour. An hour felt like a heartbeat. The sun did not move. The shadows did not shift. We were trapped in a single moment of terror, suspended like flies in amber, waiting for the sky to fall. Then the great bronze beast decided to come closer. It did not fall like a rock thrown from a cliff. It sank. It lowered itself slowly, with a terrible, controlled grace, like a stone sinking through thick honey. As it came down, it swallowed the rest of the sky. The blue disappeared. The sun was extinguished. The world around us turned a dull, flat gray, trapped in the shadow of this floating mountain. I looked up. Though my neck screamed in protest, the belly of the craft was directly above us now. It was a sight that the mind refused to accept. The metal sides were dull bronze, but the underside was something else entirely. It was black, but not the black of night or of coal. It was a hole. It was a void. It drank the light and gave nothing back. It looked like a tear in the fabric of the world, leading to a place where there was nothing at all. To look into it was to feel your soul being pulled upward, dragged out of your body and into that emptiness. The mountain began to protest. The ground beneath our boots, solid granite that had stood since the beginning of time, started to shiver. It was not an earthquake that rolls and pitches. It was a vibration, a fast, violent shaking that rattled the teeth in my skull. Loose pebbles of ice and rock began to dance on the ledge. Snow that had clung to the cliffs for 100 winters shook loose and fell into the fog below. The mountain was trembling, terrified of the thing that hovered over its peak. The light around the edges of the craft began to behave in ways that made me sick. It did not travel straight. It bent. The sunlight that tried to peek around the rim of the bell twisted into shapes that hurt to look at. It curled and rippled like oil on water. The air itself seemed to knot and tangle. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the twisted images burned in the darkness of my mind. It was as if the presence of this thing was too heavy for the air to hold, and the world was buckling under the weight. We scrambled like frightened rats, crawling on our bellies to get behind a cluster of boulders. It offered no real protection. If the bronze mountain fell, we would be crushed to dust. But the instinct to hide was overpowering. I huddled there, pressing my face into the freezing rock, smelling the moss and the fear. Beside me, Miller was murmuring. He was a man who had never stepped foot in a church since he was a boy. But he was praying now. He spoke to gods he had forgotten, begging for deliverance, his voice cracking like dry wood. The fear that washed over us was not the fear of dying. Soldiers know the fear of dying. This was different. This was the fear of the prey. We were rabbits in a field, and the hawk's shadow had just covered us. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to break its cage. The sheer mass of the object above us pressed down on my spirit, crushing the hope out of me. It was too big, too silent, and too close. And then, the silence broke. It didn't end with a bang or a roar. It ended with a sound that made my skin crawl. It was a soft, high-pitched ripping noise. It sounded like a giant sheet of fine silk being torn slowly down the middle by invisible hands. It came from directly above us, from the black belly of the machine. The sound cut through the freezing air, sharp and precise, and I knew, with a sinking dread, that the thing was opening up. The hole in the bottom of the bronze mountain did not open like a door. There were no hinges screaming, no heavy bolts sliding back. The metal simply ceased to be. A circle of the black underside dissolved, turning from solid iron into a swirling gray mist, and then into nothing at all. It left a gap, a mouth of soft, milky light that glowed against the shadow of the craft. It was wrong to watch. Metal should not vanish like smoke. Then the figures came. I expected ropes. I expected ladders or chains, the tools of men who need to climb down from heights. But there were no tools. They stepped out into the empty air, and they did not fall. They drifted. They floated down as if they were sinking in a calm lake. They stood upright, their feet pointing to the ground, descending with a slow, sickening grace. It defied every law of nature I had ever known. A man falls. A stone falls. These things treated the thin mountain air as if it were a solid floor. They looked like men. But they were not men. They were like drawings of men, made by a child who does not understand how a body fits together. They were too tall, stretched thin like taffy. Their limbs were long, unnaturally long, hanging down past where their knees should be. They moved with a jerky, twitching motion. It reminded me of a marionette puppet when the strings are pulled too tight and too fast. It was a movement that lacked the fluid grace of a living thing. They were wrapped in something that I cannot call clothing. It was the color of the fog, a pale, shifting gray that seemed to blur into the snow behind them. I tried to focus on their edges, to see where the figure ended and the winter air began, but my eyes slid off them. They were indistinct, like a smudge on a pair of spectacles that you cannot wipe away. They were shadows cut from the mist. When they touched the ground, there was no sound, no crunch of boots on the ice, no thud of weight landing. They touched down as lightly as a feather settling on a pillow, and they did not sink. We had fought for every step in that deep snow, sinking to our knees. These beings stood right on top of the powder, leaving no footprint. It was as if they were hollow, shells with nothing inside but air. I slammed my heavy woolen glove over my mouth. I bit down hard on the leather to stifle the scream that was clawing its way up my throat. Beside me, Miller was white as a sheet, his eyes wide and staring, his breath coming in short, terrified gasps. We were witnessing a nightmare that had stepped out of the dark and into the day. My mind raced through the stories of my grandmother, demons, spirits, the fair folk. But none of those words fit. This was something colder. There were 4 of them. They moved as one. When the leader turned its head, the others turned at the exact same instant. There was no shouting, no hand signals, no orders given. They moved like the fingers of a single hand, controlled by a single mind, and they did not look at us. We were crouched only 20 paces away, shivering and terrified, but they did not turn. They ignored us completely. To them, we were less than the rocks. We were not even worth a glance. They turned their backs to us and began their silent work, and that indifference was more frightening than any threat. The tall, gray figures broke their stillness all at once. It was not a command I heard, but they all moved together, like a flock of starlings turning in the evening sky. They knelt in the snow. They did not bend comfortably as a man does. Their knees hinged sharply, and their long backs remained perfectly straight. They were focused entirely on the ground, on the few patches where the wind had scoured the snow away to reveal the frozen earth and the hardy plants that cling to life up there. In their hands, they held objects I could not understand. They were dark, smooth shapes, neither wood nor iron. From the ends of these tools spilled a light that made my stomach turn. It was not the warm yellow of a candle or the bright white of the sun. It was a sickly color, a pale, jaundiced yellow like the skin of a man dying of liver fever. It washed over the rocks and the ice, making the world look bruised and old. I watched, holding my breath, as one of the figures reached toward a small cluster of edelweiss flowers blooming in the shelter of a crag. The being did not pull the flower or dig at the roots with a trowel. It pointed the rod, and the yellow light touched the petals. In an instant, the soil around the plant separated. It was a perfect square, cut as if by a razor, sharper than any barber possesses. The figure lifted its hand, and the block of earth, roots, and flower floated up into its palm. There was no crumbling of dirt. It was surgical. It was a harvest of impossible precision. Another figure turned to a boulder that must have weighed as much as a cart horse. It was a slab of granite that had fallen from the peak centuries ago. The gray hand touched it, and the rock lifted. The being did not grunt or strain. Its muscles did not bulge. It moved the massive stone aside as if it were made of dry leaves or paper. It tossed the boulder to the side, and it landed in the snow with a soft thud that felt wrong for its weight. They were moving the mountain itself to get to what lay beneath. That is when the true horror settled in. I had thought they were soldiers, I had thought they were demons sent to punish us for our sins. But as I watched them place the soil samples into containers that appeared from nowhere, I realized the truth. They were not hunting. They were foraging. They were like botanists in a garden, or farmers checking the quality of the soil before the sowing. They worked with a cold, detached efficiency. There was no joy in their discovery, no anger in their movements. They were simply taking what they wanted. The indifference of it froze my blood more than the wind ever could. If a wolf looks at you, it looks at you with hunger. There is a connection there, a battle of wills. But these things, to them, we were just part of the background. We were no more important than the lichen on the rocks. They were tearing apart our world, stealing the very flowers from our mountains. And they did not care enough to even acknowledge that we were watching. It was a twisted mockery of a scientific expedition, performed by ghosts in the silence of the death zone. Miller could not take it anymore. I felt the change in him before I saw it. The terror that had frozen us was melting, replaced by a desperate, frantic need to do something. He was a man who had walked through the fires of war. He knew how to fight men, how to fight beasts, how to fight the cold. But he did not know how to sit still and watch his world be taken apart by ghosts. His breathing changed from short gasps to a low growl in his throat. He was done hiding. I saw his hand move. It was slow, trembling, but full of purpose. He reached for the rifle strapped across his back. It was an old piece, heavy wood and iron, trusted and true. He had carried it up the mountain to fend off wolves or bears, not this. I wanted to stop him. I wanted to grab his arm and scream that bullets would pass through these shadows like smoke. But my own fear held my tongue. I watched as his fingers curled around the cold wood of the stock. Then the air clamped down on us. It did not push us over. It held us still. It was as if the space around our bodies turned into solid ice in the blink of an eye. Miller froze. His hand was halfway to his shoulder, his fingers white on the gun. He did not move. He could not move. I tried to lift my head, to shout, to wiggle a toe. Nothing happened. My body was a statue. I was a prisoner in my own skin, staring out through eyes that could not blink. Then came the heat. I saw Miller's face twist in agony, though his body remained rigid. Smoke began to curl up from his glove. The rifle, the cold iron that had been freezing to the touch moments ago, was suddenly burning. It glowed with a dull, red anger. The leather strap across his chest began to smoke and hiss. The weapon was reacting to his intent, punishing him for the thought of violence. He could not let go. The heat seared his palm, burning through the wool, but his hand was locked in that invisible grip. A sound pierced my skull. It was not a noise from the outside. It started deep in the center of my brain. It was a high, drilling whine, like a mosquito buzzing right against the eardrum. But louder. Louder. It rose to a scream that drowned out every thought. I could not think of the cold. I could not think of home. I could only think of the pain. It was a white-hot needle pushed into the mind, scrambling the senses. It shut us down. It reduced us to meat and bone, stripped of will. We were helpless. I have never felt such smallness. To be a man is to have choices, to run, to fight, to speak. But we had no choices left. We were ants beneath a heavy boot, waiting to be crushed, unable to even scuttle away. An invisible weight pressed on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs until I was sipping oxygen in tiny, desperate drafts. And through it all, the gray figures did not turn. They did not pause in their harvest. The one lifting the stone did not look up. The one cutting the earth did not flinch. They knew. They knew we were there, and they knew we were threats, and they neutralized us without even looking at us. It was not a battle. A man does not battle a gnat. He's swatting it without breaking his stride. That is what we were to them. Gnats. Frozen, burning, silent gnats. The paralysis held us fast, but my eyes were still open, forced to witness what came next. From the dark, open belly of the bronze mountain, a new shape emerged. It was a beam, but to call it a beam is to lie. It was not like the ray of a lighthouse or the glow of a torch. It poured. It spilled slowly from the craft, like thick white milk being tipped from a giant jug. It was a solid column of brightness that descended until it touched the ridge 100 yards away. It scanned the mountain face. It moved across the stone and ice with a terrible, mechanical patience. The light did not fade at the edges, like a sunbeam. It was a perfect cylinder, sharp and defined. And where it ended, it simply stopped. It cut off in midair as if it had hit a wall of glass. It looked heavy, dense, as if a man could reach out and grab a handful of it. It did not illuminate the dark, it replaced it. Where that white pillar touched the snow, the world screamed in silence. The snow did not just melt, it vanished. It turned to steam instantly, exploding upward in a hiss that I felt in my bones. And then, just as fast as the light moved on, the water froze again. It left behind slick, black sheets of ice where a deep powder had been a second before. It was unmaking and remaking the mountain in the span of a heartbeat. I squeezed my eyelids shut as the beam swept closer to us. I was terrified of the blindness it would bring. But even through my closed eyes, I could see the glare. It was a violent red, burning through the thin skin of my lids. It was bright enough that I could see the map of my own veins, a web of blood glowing against the dark. I waited for the fire to take me. Then came the heat. It washed over us, but it was a wrong, confusing sensation. The air in my lungs was still biting cold, freezing the moisture in my nose into crystals. But my skin felt like it was standing next to an open blast furnace. It was a heat that ignored the air, passing through the cold to cook the flesh directly. It felt like a fever rising from the inside out. My blood felt hot and heavy in my veins, bubbling under the skin, while my breath still puffed out in white clouds of frost. The vibration in my head shifted. It moved from the skull to the teeth. They chattered and ached, rattling in their sockets as if they were loose stones in a shaken tin. It felt like a dentist's drill was working on every tooth at once. The bone of my jaw hummed with it. It was a sound you feel, not hear. A deep, resonant thrumming that shook the very calcium in my skeleton. For a moment, as the beam passed near a jagged outcrop of rock, the world looked thin. The stone seemed to turn transparent. I saw the ghost of the rock, the gray outline of it. And then I saw the dark sky behind it. It was as if the light was peeling back the skin of the world to see the nothingness underneath. Reality felt like a sheet of paper that was being held too close to a candle, curling and browning, ready to burn away entirely. I thought I was going insane. I thought the mountain was dissolving, and us with it, turning into mist to be sucked up by the bronze bell. Then, as quickly as they had arrived, the work was done. There was no signal that I could hear, no bell rung to end the shift. But the gray figures stopped their harvest in unison. They stood up from the snow, their long, spindly limbs unfolding like spider legs. The boxes of stolen earth vanished into the folds of their mist-colored suits. They turned their backs on the mountain and on us, and looked up at the black hole above. They did not walk to a rope or a ladder. They simply lifted. It was violent in its speed. One moment they were standing on the ice, and the next they were blurred streaks of gray shooting upward. It looked like smoke being sucked up a chimney in a gale. They were pulled back into the belly of the bronze mountain with a force that should have crushed bone. They did not flail or struggle. They were limp, accepting the pull of the void. In a heartbeat, they were gone, swallowed by the dark. The hole in the bottom of the craft began to close. It did not slide shut like a barn door. The metal grew. It bloomed from the edges of the darkness, knitting itself together in the center. It looked like a wound healing in seconds, skin growing over raw meat. The black void shrank to a circle, then a dot, then nothing. The underside of the bell was smooth again, unbroken bronze, as if there had never been an opening at all. The seamless perfection of it made my eyes water. It denied the very existence of the inside. Then the movement started. The massive object, which had hung so still that it seemed nailed to the sky, began to turn. It spun slowly at first, a lazy rotation like a mill wheel in a slow river. The air around it began to distort. The light of the sun, which had been trapped behind it, started to bleed around the edges. But the colors were wrong. They were not the gold of the sun. The air turned a bruised, violent violet. It was the color of a storm sky right before a tornado touches down, but brighter, sickly, and glowing. The spinning grew faster. The shape of the bell blurred at the edges. It became a smudge of bronze and purple against the blue. The wind began to pick up, swirling around the base of the craft in a tight, angry cyclone. Snow was ripped from the peaks and pulled upward, spiraling into the vortex. The sound returned, but it was not the sound of the wind. The low hum that had rattled my teeth began to pitch up. It climbed the scale, higher and higher. It went past the whine of a saw blade. It went past the shriek of a steam whistle. It rose until it was a sound I could no longer hear, but I could feel it drilling into the center of my brain. It was a scream that existed only inside the skull. My nose began to bleed, hot drops falling onto the frozen snow. I felt the crushing weight on my chest begin to lift. The invisible hand that had pinned us to the rock was letting go, not out of mercy, but because its attention was turning elsewhere. I gasped, sucking in a lungful of thin, freezing air. It tasted sweet. It tasted like life. We were still small, still terrified, but we were no longer held down by the will of the giants. The craft began to rise. It did not shoot up yet. It drifted up, gaining height inch by inch. The shadow it cast on the mountain began to shrink. The world seemed to pause. The wind held its breath. The loose stones stopped rattling. Everything, the rocks, the ice, the two trembling men, waited for the blow that was about to fall. We knew, in the deep animal part of our brains, that the departure would be worse than the arrival. The sky was tight, stretched to the breaking point, waiting to snap. Then, the mountain released us. The bronze beast did not climb into the sky like a bird or a kite. It did not gather speed like a locomotive leaving a station. It simply refused to be where it was. One heartbeat, it was hovering heavily above the peaks, filling our vision with its dull metal skin. The next heartbeat, it was a speck, a tiny black flaw in the blue dome of the heavens. It moved with a speed that made the eyes hurt. It blurred the line between being there and being gone. If a man were inside that shell, he would have been turned to soup against the walls. No living thing could survive a leap like that. I curled into a ball, wrapping my arms over my head. I waited for the thunder. When a cannon fires, the boom shakes the ground. When lightning splits the air, the clap deafens you. Something that size, moving that fast, should have torn the sky apart. It should have shattered the glaciers and brought an avalanche down on our heads. I braced for the shockwave that would surely kill us. But the blow never landed. There was no thunder. There was no roar. The only sound was a sudden, violent rush of air. It was the sound of the world gasping. The craft had moved so quickly that it left a hole in the atmosphere, a vacuum that the air rushed to fill. It was a giant, sucking whoosh, like a door being slammed in a drafty house, but magnified 1,000 times. The wind pulled at our clothes, dragging us toward the place where the ship had been, trying to fill the emptiness it left behind. I looked up, trembling. Where the craft had vanished, the sky was wounded. It had punched a hole through a cloud that had not been there a moment before. It was a perfect circular tunnel bored straight up through the white vapor. Through that tunnel, I could see the dark, indigo blue of the highest sky, the color of space where the air ends. The edges of the hole swirled and twisted, trying to close, but the path of the machine remained open, a scar on the face of the heavens. A trail lingered in the wake of the ascent. It was not smoke from an engine. It was a mist that glowed with a faint, sickly light. It hung in the air like a cobweb, shimmering with colors that had no name. It smelled of ozone and scorched dust, the smell of a blacksmith's shop when the iron is white hot. It slowly began to drift down, dissolving into the wind, but the sight of it made my skin itch. It was the residue of a power we were never meant to see. Then, nature remembered itself. The silence that had trapped us for so long shattered. The wind returned instantly. It did not ramp up. It slammed into us. The familiar, hateful howl of the alpine gale roared back to life. It bit at our faces and tore at our hoods. It was violent. It was freezing. And it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of the real world. It was the sound of the mountain waking up from its trance. I gasped, my lungs filling with the thin, biting air. The pressure on my chest was gone. The invisible vice that had squeezed my heart released its grip. I fell forward onto the snow, coughing and weeping. I dug my fingers into the ice, needing to feel something solid, something cold and hard and true. The sickness in my gut began to fade, replaced by the simple, sharp exhaustion of a man who has survived a fall. The bronze mountain was gone, and we were left alone in the howling wind, small and broken, but alive. We did not speak. There were no words left in us. The wind was screaming again, but the silence was still inside our heads, a heavy, muffled ringing that would not fade. I looked at Miller. His face was a ruin. It was red and raw, as if he had spent a week drifting on an open raft under a tropical sun. The skin was blistering, peeling away in ragged strips. I raised a trembling hand to my own cheek and felt the heat radiating from it. We were burned. But the sun had been hidden behind the gray metal of the beast, and the sky was thick with clouds. This was not a burn from the day star. It was a burn from the light that stopped the snow. It was a kiss from the furnace of the unknown. I reached for my watch, a sturdy thing of brass and glass that had survived 2 wars. I wanted to know how much time had been stolen from us. I pulled it from my pocket, but the ticking was gone. The hands were frozen. They pointed to the exact moment the wind had died. I shook it. I held it to my ear. It was dead metal. The gears inside were fused. The springs snapped. It had stopped not because it was broken, but because time itself had ceased to matter up there on the ridge. I put it back in my pocket. I never fixed it. It stays in a drawer now, a monument to the hour the world ended. The descent was a blur. I do not remember finding the path. I do not remember clipping the ropes or testing the ice. Our bodies took over. We were machines made of meat, moving on instinct. One foot down, then the other. We stumbled like men deep in their cups, sliding on the loose scree, catching ourselves on jagged rocks. We did not care. The fear of falling was gone. After you have looked into the bottom of a floating mountain and seen the void, a drop off a cliff seems like a small thing. We reached the tree line as the evening light began to fail. The smell of pine resin and damp earth should have been comforting. It should have smelled like life. But to me, it smelled of rot. The trees looked fragile, like matchsticks stuck in the mud, waiting to be snapped by a gray hand. The birds were singing their evening songs, ignorant and happy. I hated them for it. I hated them for not knowing what hovered above their heads. When the lights of the village came into view, twinkling in the valley floor, I stopped. Miller stopped beside me. We stood there in the growing dark, two burned ghosts looking down at the world of men. We looked at each other. No words were exchanged, but a pact was made in that look. It was a promise forged in terror. We would not speak of this. We would not tell the priest or the mayor or our wives. To speak of it would be to bring it down with us. To name the horror would be to make it real for them too. We swallowed the truth like a sharp stone. It sat in our guts, heavy and cold. We walked into the village like strangers. The tavern was full of noise and heat. Men were laughing, slamming mugs on timber tables, complaining about the price of wool or the harshness of the winter. Their worries seemed so small. They seemed like the worries of children playing in a sandbox while a wolf watches from the woods. I drank my ale, but it tasted like ash. I sat by the fire, but I could not get warm. The cold of the shadow was still in my marrow. That night, sleep did not come. When I closed my eyes, I saw the smooth, rivetless bronze. I saw the pale weavers floating in the mist. I saw the light that unmade the world. I lay in my bed, listening to the breathing of my wife, and I felt a terrible distance. She was in one world, a world of safety and rules and solid ground. I was in another, a world where mountains fly and men are nothing more than weeds to be plucked. I never climbed the high peaks again. I sold my gear. I took a job in the valley, working with wood, with things I could touch and shape and understand. Miller drank himself to death 3 years later. He never told anyone why, but I knew. He was trying to drown the humming in his teeth. He was trying to forget the feeling of being paralyzed under the gaze of a giant. Now, I am an old man. My skin is leather, and my hands shake. But I still cannot look at the night sky. When others look up to admire the stars or the harvest moon, I look at the ground. I know what is up there. I know that the darkness between the stars is not empty. It is full of silent ships and cold eyes. They are watching us. They are waiting. And we are just waiting to be harvested.